Welcome back to the county seat. We are talking today about the prairie dogs and an updated recovery plan or management plan that's been in place since the spring. So far, we've looked at the basis of how it works. A little later in the show, we'll see how it's working on the ground. Right now, it's time to talk about policy. To join us for that conversation is Laura Romin, who is the Deputy Field Supervisor for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Thank you for joining us. And Chris Keleher, who is the Recovery Program Director for the Division of Natural Resources here in the state of Utah. Thank you both for joining us. You guys work a lot on this together?
We do.
Yeah, we have for the past several years. Yeah.
You know, you got each other's like cell phones and
oh, definitely.
Yeah.
meet for lunch a lot. Okay. What has changed in the prairie dog management plan from, say, early this spring? How is it different now than it was just before the plan was implemented?
Well, I think in kind of a nutshell that the previous, we had a previous what we call a habitat conservation plan in Iron County, which provided the process for developers to get what we call clearances for prairie dogs on their property. That plan was done in 1998, and over time we found some problems with it, some difficulties that the county had implementing it. And then there was an interim state management plan for a couple years that tried to address some of those concerns that the communities had. And so in this new general conservation plan, we've tried to combine components that worked from the old habitat conservation plan and the state plan to try to provide a plan into the future that actually works for people and for prairie dogs.
So if the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service plan supersedes other plans, how does the state plan get in there to work?
Well, the state plan was an interim plan based on a court decision that allowed the state to have management authority on non-federal lands for prairie dog. That decision was overturned, but in the interim we did have a state plan that was put together with local elected officials and local municipalities, and it functioned well enough that when this new plan was put together, when the decision was overturned and the federal government got management authority back, the new plan recognized the value in what the state had been doing, and a lot of those activities were incorporated into this new plan. And another thing that was incorporated into it is in order to keep costs down for local landowners and developers, the Fish and Wildlife Service allowed us to credit funding that is going from the state to recover Utah prairie dogs to offset the cost of some of those impacts.
So I've got a piece of private land, and I'm getting ready to build, and the prairie dogs beat me to it, and they build there first. What were my options last year to be able to proceed on building? What were my options to get the land clear?
So last year being under the state plan, there was no what we call mitigation requirement for that property owner. So the property owner would just need to report the loss of dogs and habitat to the state just for tracking purposes, and then they could build. When the court returned authority back to Fish and Wildlife Service, we have, of course, other regulations where we have to be able to show mitigation. And so there's now a process in place where a landowner works through either the county or through us directly to implement that mitigation, and then they can clear. And the mitigation is really just payment of a fee, which then those fees are used to offset impacts by developing new prairie dog habitats on federal lands.
How do they actually get the dogs off the property? Do they just give them an eviction notice, or do they just start digging and they run?
We wish that it was that easy.
We've got some really good staff in Cedar City working on prairie dog in the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources, and they go into those areas. They'll get when somebody applies for a permit, they'll go into those areas and trap as many dogs as they can off of those areas, and then move them to these newly developed translocation sites that Laura referred to on federal land. So
And I should just, say that the BLM and Forest Service are part of this whole process in helping us to create some of these new translocation sites and implement plague management for the species, because that really helps to get them established.
So I think I want to step back just a little bit and look at this. I guess I have one side question first. I live on a piece of property. I don't have property dogs, and they take up residence in my yard. Now what do I do?
So we actually have a separate, what we call a 4D rule for prairie dogs. And if prairie dogs are creating what we call a health and safety issue, which would include prairie dogs in a yard, they can be translocated away from that property. And the state is doing those translocations.
And that's just all done by trapping.
Yeah.
You don't pull a Bill Murray on them.
We want to take advantage of those dogs and get them to areas that are protected for prairie dog recovery, and then they count towards that recovery that we're trying to achieve.
On a broader issue of how we determine that species are endangered, I know it usually starts with a petition, a lawsuit from a group, or a challenge or something like that, and then you guys have to jump into gear and jump through a whole bunch of hoops and either determine it is or it isn't. How do you calculate numbers to determine that a species is endangered?
So there's actually several different things that you look at. It's not only numbers. You could theoretically have a species that has a very small population, but has no threats to that population, and so they would not need to be an endangered species or threatened species. So it's really about what the threats are. So when the prairie dog was listed, and when we developed the recovery plan, the most current one being in 2012, the primary threats right now to the species are ongoing development on private lands and plague. So we're really trying to work with those two impacts to get the species now to recovery.
So do you calculate populations differently? I mean, I have heard that when you're calculating numbers to determine if they need protection or not, you can only count them on federal land. The numbers on private land don't count. How does that work?
So all the prairie dogs are counted regardless of where they are, because we want to establish the trend of the population. But for recovery purposes, because development is one of the primary threats, we, in quotes, count the ones on federal or other protected lands toward recovery. But all prairie dogs are counted. And we're actually working with the state now on a population viability analysis to see where those really fit in.
Okay, so the rumors that I hear that say that a species may not actually be endangered, but because they only count the critters on public land, their numbers look like they're more endangered, and so they become listed, even though there are like 6 million of them living in Farmer Jones' hayfield.
I don't know if you want to jump in.
Our local Division of Wildlife folks are working very closely with municipalities and the counties in that area, and everybody in this partnership is really looking towards recovery and delisting and what we need to do to get to that point. And one of the big things is if we could count those prairie dogs on private land, that would add to our tally and help us get towards recovery. And one way to do that is to put in some regulatory mechanisms that would protect dogs in areas where people aren't interested in developing,
Even if it's private or...
Even if it's private, if we have those dogs protected to the extent that the Fish and Wildlife Service agrees that, with it, that then we can start counting some of those dogs towards recovery.
This may be an unfair question for either or both of you. How many species, prevalent species, are listed as endangered in the state of Utah?
43?
Yeah, it's somewhere around that, give or take. a lot of them are plant species. We have about half of our listed species here are plants.
I was going to say that I did not expect it to be quite that high,
Yeah.
so I was a little surprised.
Well, it's actually, compared to other states, it's relatively low. We've done a good job in Utah at preventing new listings just by active conservation efforts that are ongoing and funded with state funding matched with some of the federal dollars that come in.
Do any of your conservation efforts that are implemented at the state level actually spill over onto federal land?
Oh, absolutely. We have a predominance of federal land, and we work very closely with the land management agencies, BLM and the Forest Service, to conserve our native species and help prevent them from becoming to the point where they need to be listed under ESA.
So until they become a threatened or an endangered species, usually it's the State Division of Wildlife that
the state has the mandate, the Division of Wildlife, to protect all those protected species.
So until they're listed, your division's basically in the driver's seat as far as management of the species goes.
Right. And then when something gets recovered and is delisted, the Division of Wildlife takes over management authority again.
And I would say even with a listed species, we rely very heavily on our collaboration with the state to then get those species to recovery.
Right. So do they ever get delisted?
We are working on delisting several species at this time. We've got a proposed rule in to delist a plant species, Deseret milkvetch, occurs down by can't remember the name of that town, Thistle. Down where it got flooded down there. But and we're working on downlisting June sucker from endangered to threatened. And then there's a number of other species we've also got in the works, and we're eyeballing Utah prairie dog for delisting in the near future. Just got to get all our ducks in a row and
Our dogs.
our dogs.
That too.
There you go.
So what was the last species that was delisted? This would be good for people. This is going to be a quiz on this one. So
I want to say the McGuire daisy, is that correct?
Yeah, I think you're
In
right.
Utah at least. But like Chris said, there's a real effort now, working together to work on some other species. So it's a real
excellent.
focus.
Any points we missed?
Nothing I can think of off the top of my head.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for joining us. We'll continue with our conversation. We'll be back in just a minute. We'll go on the ground and see what it looks like with the new program that has taken effect and how residents feel about it. We'll be right back with the county seat.